Welcome friends, Russ Barkley here. This is another video on ADHD, and in this brief commentary I'm going to talk about why ADHD is considered to be a disorder. Very interesting question that we run into a lot, particularly in the trade media, where we often hear people question whether ADHD exists at all. Is it a myth? Is it just part of normal variation or neurodiversity? So let's cover that in some detail. ADHD is considered a disorder because it meets several criteria that we require to be met for a disorder to be considered a disorder. So when anybody challenges ADHD as being a myth or not being a disorder, the first thing we want to do is to ask them, well, what criteria are you using to reach that conclusion? You must have some. You must have applied that criteria to the substantial literature on ADHD and come away with the idea that ADHD doesn't meet your specific criteria. So when I press critics like that on what is your basis for rendering that conclusion, well, guess what? They don't have any. They really haven't thought about it. They either don't want ADHD to exist for various political or fringe religious reasons or for some other explanation, or they think that for a disorder to exist, there has to be some objective lab test that we can apply to the individual to reach a reliable conclusion that they have a disorder. Well, there are no objective tests for ADHD, just like there are no objective tests for all other mental and neurodevelopmental disorders, and there are no objective tests for many medical disorders that we still treat as disorders, like migraine headache, for instance, among others. Early mild cognitive impairment that presages dementia. These are difficult things to measure and quantify. So the idea that ADHD doesn't have an objective test is not really a sound criticism that the disorder doesn't exist, unless you're going to rule out, of course, all other mental and neurodevelopmental disorders too, which of course is ridiculous. So, and this is why many critics who make these statements really don't have a leg to stand on or criteria to back up what they're saying. So let's take a look at the criteria that are used in psychiatry and psychology to reach a conclusion that a disorder exists. Now, there's some criticism of this particular view, as there should be in our science and as we try to reach a more precise definition of a disorder. But for now, this definition, rendered by Jerome Wakefield back in the late 1990s, seems to be standing the test of time. And I personally think it's very appropriate for our use. And it certainly applies to ADHD. But let's take a quick look at what Wakefield was talking about. Wakefield says that for a mental disorder to be a disorder, it must be a harmful dysfunction. Two criteria, harm and dysfunction. Let's take the second of those first. Wakefield says that a disorder is a dysfunction in an evolved psychological adaptation that is universal to the species, in this case, to humans. It's part of our species design, if you will. And there must be evidence that that particular psychological adaptation is failing, or is failing to such an extent that it is leading to negative or harmful consequences for the individual. Take language, for instance. Language is a universal adaptation to humans. When there is evidence in a particular case, say a child, that language is not developing well, is failing to develop entirely, that is a failure in a mental mechanism that is an adaptation for humans and that is universal to our species. Humans have several hundred psychological adaptations that if we are developing typically, normally, These adaptations should blossom with development to become functional, to assist the individual in living within the particular ecology where we find them. So the first criteria we need to look for is there a failure in a mental mechanism universal to humans that underlies ADHD? And the answer is yes. ADHD is not just a problem with sustained attention. As I've said many times, it is a problem with executive functioning. The executive functions of the human brain, which are granted to us by virtue of the development of our frontal and prefrontal cortex and its networks to other parts of the brain. The executive functions are universal to humans and should develop anywhere, anytime that a human is developing. And when they don't develop well, when there is evidence of their failure, that meets the criteria of Wakefield's definition. And ADHD, as we know, has hundreds of studies that underlie the conclusion that it is a disorder of executive functioning, not just of inhibition, not just of inattention or of activity regulation, but of the 7 or more, but at least 7 major executive functions that give us self-regulation. So the development of self-regulation, which is a evolved mental mechanism, is not functioning well in ADHD. Now, how bad does it have to get? After all, dysfunction can be viewed as a dimension. And so some of us don't do very well at some things, but we wouldn't consider that to be a failure. We're just not particularly good at them. I'm not especially good at visual spatial skills or athletics. But does that degree of ineffectiveness in my functioning reach a point where I experience harm? And that's Wakefield's second requirement. There must be demonstration of harm that accrues to the individual as a result of this dysfunction in a mental mechanism. Harm can be broken down into at least 3 forms. Is there evidence of increased mortality in these individuals with this disorder as a consequence of having the disorder? Well, you know from my other presentations on the network that ADHD does lead to an increase in early mortality. Children are twice to 3 times as likely to die by age 10 from their risk-taking, accidental injuries, and so on. Adults with ADHD are 4 to 5 times more likely to die young, before age 45, as a consequence of accidental injuries, their risk-taking and maladventures, and in this case, increased risk for suicide and to some extent homicide. And we also know that there's an increased risk of a shortened life expectancy, even if you make it to midlife, if your disorder is not being treated. In my other lecture on the health outcomes of ADHD, I show you the evidence that ADHD shortens life expectancy by about 11 to 13 years. So we have evidence that ADHD leads to harm to individuals with the disorder. Now, there doesn't have to be evidence of death or mortality. There could be evidence of increased morbidity. Physical injury accrues to the individual as a consequence of having this disorder, or there is an increase in other medical problems that require treatment. So, is there evidence for this? Well, yes. Go and have a look at my lecture on health outcomes again, where I lay out all of the evidence for increased accidental injuries of all kinds: poisonings, broken bones, lacerations, a dental trauma, closed head injury. All of these and more are much more likely to occur in children and adults with ADHD. And there are other medical problems as well. So here again, we have significant evidence that people who have this dysfunction in executive functioning that reaches a certain extent of severity are going to experience heightened morbidity. But even in the absence of evidence for mortality and morbidity, is there evidence of impairment in major life activities that are universal to our species? Things that we must be capable of doing in order to function effectively. Now again, effective or ineffective function can be viewed somewhat dimensionally. How bad does it have to get before we view this as impairment? There must be evidence of negative consequences accruing to the individual in that domain of life that is well beyond what the typical or average individual experiences in their life in that domain. Let me put it another way. Quite simply, impairment means the environment is kicking back. Negative consequences are accumulating as a function of behaving this way with this dysfunction. Consequences in social development, family functioning, school functioning, work or occupational functioning, sexual behavior, managing money, raising children, entering into intimate relationships with others. We could go on and on. There are others. My impairment rating scale lists at least 15 domains of major life activity. If there's evidence that any of those is ineffective in functioning, such that negative harm or consequences is occurring to the individual, then we've met the second criteria. So again, harm means increased mortality, increased morbidity, or ineffective functioning to the extent that negative consequences are occurring beyond what is seen in typical life. ADHD, as you can see from all the lectures on my channel, easily meets both of these criteria. Now, in contrast, there are a couple of other things called disorders that might not meet Wakefield's definition. Let's take a look at oppositional defiant disorder. At the present time, it's not clear that there's evidence that some mental mechanism is failing when a child argues or defies a parent. So, ODD or conduct disorder or some others may not meet this criteria and may not be disorders under Wakefield's definition. That doesn't mean we don't treat them. We can consider them as problems in living that lead to significant conflict between the individual and their family or their community, depending on which of those disorders we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that we can point to some underlying universal mental mechanism that is failing in that individual. But ADHD, in contrast, does meet both criteria handily. Now, dysfunction, as I've said, is not categorical. It can fall along a continuum. And as I've said, at what point does the failure or the low degree of executive functioning and self-regulation lead to a diagnosis, of a disorder? And as I've said, that is when adverse consequences occur. So let's wrap it up here for a moment in summary and say that if there is no harm, if there's no impairment, then there's no disorder. It really doesn't matter how symptomatic an individual might be. The symptoms must be sufficiently severe and developmentally inappropriate to lead to harm. So as I teach my students, or I used to teach them before I retired, disorders begin where impairment and harm begin. No impairment, no disorder. No harm, no foul, so to speak. So that is why we say that ADHD is a disorder. It meets Wakefield's definition. And we can use that then to contradict critics that say there's no disorder here. Well, yes, there is if you use this definition. Now, to wrap it up, there is a useful distinction I'm making here that I want to make clear between symptoms and impairment, because I find that Many lay people, and even my colleagues in the profession, often confuse these terms a bit. They might say that if a person is speeding with a motor vehicle, for instance, which adults with ADHD do more than others, that's either impairment or a symptom. Or they might say that if somebody gets a low score on a test of attention span, such as a continuous performance test, that's evidence of impairment. Well, no, it's not. Both of the things I just mentioned are symptoms. So let's break it down a little bit in the next slide. I'll come back to that other one in just a moment. A disorder can be thought of as, in the case of neurodevelopmental disorders, a neurogenetic disorder that occurs as a result of genetics that may go on to influence brain development in such a way that the brain isn't functioning well, and that leads to evidence, as you see here from neuroimaging, that the brain isn't developing properly and its networks aren't functioning properly. So in ADHD, we have a neurogenetic disorder that then gives rise to certain cognitive and behavioral expressions. Those are the symptoms. So symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, deficient executive function, globally just poor self-regulation. Now, what's an impairment? An impairment is the environment kicking back. Consequences that ensue within major domains of life activity as a result of showing the symptoms. So, symptoms are behaviors and cognitive expressions. Impairments are the outcomes. The environment kicking back with harm, mortality, morbidity, and evidence of substantial ineffective functioning. So let's make sure that we distinguish between symptoms and impairments when we think about ADHD. As I said in one of my earlier lectures on executive functioning, ADHD is the lower tail of the distribution of self-regulation in the population. And there are people with average executive functioning, above average executive functioning, but the minute you get into the low average range, you are becoming symptomatic. You don't have a disorder yet, you're not diagnosable. But there's a point here where your competence in executive functioning and self-regulation is so bad that it starts to cause harm. And at that point, right around here, we draw a line, make the diagnosis, and consider the individual as having this disorder. So that's just another way of rendering what we're talking about here in using Wakefield's definition. There is sufficient failure in the display of executive functioning that causes harm. So we can move on past this slide. And now you have the criteria you need to confront the critics of ADHD who say it's a myth, there's no disorder here, it's just a problem in living, it's just a mismatch between the person and the particular culture, so no problem. Well, that's not true. ADHD does meet this very elegant, simple, two-part criteria for defining a mental disorder. So thank you, everybody. I hope you found that informative. Join me again on this channel for future brief commentaries and research summaries. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, please, if you're interested in being a subscriber. And if you like, please recommend this channel to others that you think might benefit from this kind of information. Thanks for joining me, everybody, and be well.